Edward's Accident. One evening, the engines were all chatting amongst themselves at Tidmouth Sheds. Percy had just returned from the works. He had had an accident with the troublesome trucks, and his repairs took a long time. "I heard you had trouble with the trucks yesterday," said Thomas. "I did," replied Percy. "They pushed me down the hill and right off the rails at a sharp bend by the harbor. I thought I was going to take the plunge again. It's one of the worst accidents I've ever had." "I know how you feel," replied Thomas. "I remember the time I crashed right through the station master's house, ruining his breakfast. That accident was really bad, and it still is to this day." "The worst accident I've ever had," said Gordon, "has to be the time when I wanted a panoramic view of Kirk Ronan Station, and I got it by crashing right through the station wall." From there, the engines all discussed the worst accidents they've ever had, like the time James crashed through a field after his wooden brake blocks caught fire, and the time Henry had to have a new shape after his crash with the flying kipper. But Edward was unusually silent. "What's wrong, Edward?" said Thomas. "What's the worst accident you've ever had?" Edward was hesitant to reply. It's really hard to talk about," he said sadly. "Come on, Edward, you can tell us," replied Thomas. "It'll make you feel a lot better." Edward knew Thomas was right. He took a big puff, gathered all the courage he could, and began telling his story. "Before you all arrived on the island, I worked with 3 other engines. Their names were Alfred, Croven, and Eagle. Alfred and Croven took the express, while Eagle and I took goods trains and local passenger trains along the main line. Eagle was a very kind engine, and always did his work with a smile on his face. I'm sorry to say the same couldn't be said about Alfred and Croven. They were the most boastful engines I'd ever met. They were forever going on about how important they were, just because they were bigger, faster, and stronger than me and Eagle. They also bragged about how they were the only engines on the railway that could pull the express, and how small, weak, and undignified we were. They were also very reckless engines, racing down the main line at top speed, stopping too quickly at the station platforms, and bumping the coaches so hard that they nearly broke to pieces. Eagle and I constantly warned them to be more careful, but they never took notice. "Listen, Eddie," snarled Alfred. "We are important express engines, and we don't have time to discuss your pathetic safety lectures." "Yeah, buddy," added Croven. "We know what we're doing out on the main line. It's normal for us to go at full speed, because we like to run ahead of schedule." "That doesn't excuse the fact that the passengers should be our main priority," said Eagle. "And don't call me Birdie. My name is Eagle." "Eagle's right, you two," snapped Edward. "If you carry on with your reckless behavior, you're both going to get into a serious accident, and your passengers will either be upset, injured, or even dead." "Nonsense," mocked Alfred. "What could possibly go wrong?" replied Croven, and they puffed away laughing. "Disgraceful," said Gordon. "Disgusting," added James. "Despicable," finished Henry. "Those 2 engines must have been real bullies," fumed Percy. "Indeed," said Edward. "Alfred and Croven were both very arrogant engines, and they didn't think anything bad would happen to them. But one day, everything changed." It was a foggy morning as I brought my local passenger train into Marin Station. There were 2 express trains running that morning. Alfred pulled one from Knapford, and Croven and Eagle double-headed the other from Vickerstown. I was sizzling nicely at the platform as I waited for the passengers to board the train. Then, Just as the conductor was walking back to his brake van after checking the doors on the last 2 coaches, it happened. Alfred crashed into the rear of my train at full speed after passing a red signal. The impact pushed me and my train 20 yards forward, and the wreckage piled up behind Alfred and onto the other line. A few moments later, Croven and Eagle, who were running at full speed in the other direction, smashed into Alfred and came off the rails. The 2 engines skidded across the station platform before coming to a rest, sprawled on their side on the other side of the platform. Over 100 people were killed, over 300 more were severely injured, and Alfred, Croven, and Eagle were scrapped. It was a horrifying accident that I'll never forget, and an accident that still haunts me to this day. The engines were shocked. They didn't speak for a long time. They had no idea that Edward had had such a horrific accident. At last, Thomas spoke up. "Cinders and ashes," he cried. "I'm so sorry, Edward. That must have been a devastating experience for you." "It was," replied Edward sadly. "I'm sorry about your friend Eagle," said Henry. "He would have been a really useful engine on our railway." "He was a good friend indeed," said Edward. "I guess Alfred and Croven got what was coming to them," added James mournfully. "Yeah," said Edward, "but I didn't think it'd be like this." "It's really sad to think about all the passengers who were injured or dead in the accident," said Percy, trying not to cry. Gordon was hesitant to speak. "Edward, that's the worst accident I've ever heard of," he said depressingly, "and I thought my accident at Kirk Ronan was bad." "Yeah," replied Edward, "it was the worst day of my life, and I'll never forget the sounds of the passengers screaming, the engines colliding, and the sounds of silence that followed." All the engines couldn't sleep that night. They felt very sorry for Edward and wanted to make him feel better. But that's another story.